I'm Lindsay Chervinsky, presidential historian and head of the George Washington Presidential Library. I'm here today to answer your questions from the internet. This is President Support. Town in That asks, can Trump run again in 2028? No. Trump is constitutionally barred for running for a third term. The 22nd Amendment, which was passed after FDR ran for 4 terms, says that presidents can only run for 2 full terms. Prior to FDR, presidents generally followed George Washington's precedent of only serving for 2 terms, but that was voluntary and not required by law. Grizzly Redneck asks, what's going on with Joe Biden pardoning his own son? Well, in Article 2 of the Constitution, the president is given almost unilateral authority to issue pardons on federal offenses except for those relating to impeachment. So while lots of presidents have issued pardons we don't necessarily like or maybe feel a little bit gross, a president's pardon power is almost unilateral. George Washington was the first president to issue a pardon. One of his first was to a rum smuggler in April of 1794. Sludge Gaze asks, was the political divide always this bad? There certainly have been times where we've had very bad partisan tensions and a big divide between the 2 different political parties. The 1790s, the 1850s, the 1890s, and the 1960s were all times when political rhetoric and how people talked to one another were really intense and often quite nasty. John Adams often referred to one of his political rivals, Alexander Hamilton, as a puppy, which was the ultimate insult to masculinity in the 1790s. And John Adams' critics said he had a hermaphroditic character because his values constantly shifted. There have been times when things have been better, when political campaigns weren't quite so awful, but this moment that we're in now is probably as bad as some of the other ones we've lived through. Hi Cat Whisperer asks, how did we end up with 2 stupid, unpopular political parties that are pretty much our only alternative? Excellent question. We have what's called a 2-party system. There have been other parties over the course of American history, generally as one of the major parties breaks down and there are various different factions. So for example, in the 1840s and 1850s, there was a Know-Nothing Party. There was the Freedom Party. Then eventually the Republican Party merged a lot of those different factions into one new party. Because of the way our primary system works and the way our Congress works, it's really hard for a third party to gain any traction. But that's not necessarily the case in other types of systems. For example, if you have a parliament, like in Great Britain, there are lots of parties that have to build coalitions in order to have governing power. Alec Emily asks, why do we even have a State of the Union address anymore? It's a waste of everyone's time. The State of the Union is actually required in the Constitution. Article 2 says that the president shall, from time to time, give updates to Congress on the State of the Union. George Washington called these his addresses to Congress, and he noted that they were indeed a required act. What's interesting about the States of the Union is from Thomas Jefferson to Woodrow Wilson, they were in writing, and the president would deliver a written address. Woodrow Wilson went back to delivering this speech in person, and they have been in person at Congress ever since. And here at George Washington's Presidential Library at Mount Vernon, we have what's called an Acts of Congress. In January of 1790, as George Washington prepared to deliver his first address to Congress, or State of the Union, we think that he made these notations in his copy of the Constitution, where you can see that he has written a notation that says required, next to the responsibility to give Congress an update. And indeed he did. Every year of his presidency, he went to Congress and delivered a spoken address telling them what had happened while they were on recess and giving some suggestions for what they might consider in the upcoming term. Kai Marsh asks, did you know Teddy Roosevelt was shot before speech and proceeded to give the entire 90-minute speech with a bullet in his chest? Yes, I did know that. A man named John Schrank thought that he was having visions that told him to try and defeat Theodore Roosevelt from winning the presidential election in 1912. Now, what's amazing about why Theodore Roosevelt survived was he had the speech folded up in his pocket, and because the speech was so long, the paper was so thick that it actually slowed down the bullet and saved his life. After he was shot, Theodore Roosevelt said, "You can't bring down Bull Moose," which is where the name Bull Moose Party comes from. Rhea Soccer Crazy asks, so apparently teddy bears were named after former US Pres Theodore Roosevelt, but why? Why? Theodore Roosevelt went on a bear hunt after his presidency, but he wasn't successful and he couldn't get any, and it made him really mad. So the people he was with actually captured one and tied it up to a willow tree so that he would have the opportunity to shoot a bear. But he felt like that wasn't very sporting and wasn't really fair to the bear, so he refused to kill it. A political cartoonist depicted this scene, and a candy maker who had a toy and candy store saw this cartoon and thought it would make an excellent children's toy. The toy maker received permission to use Teddy's name for the bear, and the teddy bear was born and has been known as such ever since. Bill Shine 8 asks, has the peaceful transition of power ever been in more doubt? Well, we have had a number of very dramatic transitions. So for example, when President Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the South seceded before he became president. So that's about as bad as it gets. Then in 1932, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected, it was in the midst of the Great Depression, and the economic conditions were horrible. But Herbert Hoover really rejected the New Deal programs that Franklin D. Roosevelt had suggested during the campaign, and they spent several months bickering over what to do with the election before FDR was finally inaugurated in March of 1933. The difference with January 6th was that it was a contested transition. We have never had one candidate reject the outcome of an election, and we've never had people try to overthrow the results of an election. The South didn't like the result in 1860, and so they left the nation. That's a very different thing. Yatpei asks, in the United States, does the president have access to all levels of classified information? Yes, the president has access to all classified information and all of the top secrets in the United States. Hockey Madman asks, what does the president do all day anyway? So the president does a lot of different things. The president consumes intelligence, the president talks with foreign leaders, makes really difficult decisions because no easy choices come to the Oval Office. The president meets with business leaders and labor leaders and members of Congress and state governments. The president hosts really important social receptions. Those can be for visiting dignitaries like state dinners. They can be from championship teams that we see sometimes at the White House, or they can be students or kids who they're trying to encourage to pursue their studies. What you can see here is an invitation from President George Washington to come to an event at the president's house in Philadelphia. This social component of the presidency was there from the very beginning, and George Washington hosted events every single week during his presidency. David Kwong asks, what does the S in Harry S. Truman stand for? Nothing. He added it in later because he thought that he needed a middle initial. Rorden508 asks, wow, the Supreme Court in America shows the world USA does not do democracy. Apparently, any incoming president can stack its highest court like it's a perk of office. Well, the Supreme Court size is not actually in the Constitution. It's totally up to Congress how many seats there are going to be on the Supreme Court at any given moment, and indeed that number has changed. The original Supreme Court was 6 justices, and George Washington appointed all 6, and then the replacements as they left. The Supreme Court has evolved over time, sometimes for political reasons. For example, the Federal Judiciary Act of 1801 reduced the size of the Supreme Court, making it harder for Jefferson to appoint a replacement because he would be from a different party. Tychus Balrog asks, why are American elections so long? Why not just have them last 2 to 4 weeks? I agree, that would be great, and a lot of other elections in other nations are much shorter. Ours have actually expanded over time, especially in the last couple of decades, as they've become more expensive, as they've become competitive, but there isn't really anything that says how short or how long they can be. The problem is, if we try and limit that by law, that could be a restriction of freedom of speech, and we have a First Amendment which makes it very difficult to limit political speech especially. Savannah Lay asks, damn, did anyone know the President Roosevelt had polio and hid it because of how the community saw disabled people? Yes, indeed. FDR did have polio, and he spent most of his presidency in a wheelchair. He was able, with the use of braces and support from his sons and his aides, to prop himself up for speeches and press conferences, but by and large, he was unable to walk. He hid it because at the time, there was a sense that if you were physically disabled, that meant you were somehow mentally impaired as well. And he understood that it would make it much harder for him to become president and much harder for him to meet with other foreign leaders and exercise the type of power that a president is required to use. The secret largely remained such because the press were willing to cooperate. It was pretty clear to people who were around him that he couldn't move around, but there was sort of a gentleman's agreement with the press at the time that this was private information and it was not their story to share. FDR never really talked about this, and this was only something that came out much later as people began to share photos and his family began to discuss his battle with polio. Employee Aromatic 6118 asks, what do you think of George Washington's take on political parties? George Washington warned against political parties in his farewell address, which he published in September of 1796 when he announced his retirement. But his ideas about political parties are often misunderstood. He wasn't saying that people shouldn't have political ideas or that they shouldn't form groups to try and get things done. What he was saying is that when we form political parties, we often identify as a Democrat or a Republican first, and as Americans second. And that was really pernicious to the long-term health of the nation. Instead, he wanted people to remember that they had more in common than what separated them, and political parties tended to exacerbate those differences. Talk Sex with Sue asks, did George Washington deal with any infectious diseases like we see today during his presidency? Yes, he did. During the Revolutionary War, George Washington had the Continental Army inoculated against smallpox, and then during his presidency, there were several outbreaks of yellow fever in Philadelphia and New York and other coastal cities. At the time, there was really a sense that disease outbreak like this one was not a responsibility of the federal government. It was a local or state issue. So a lot of times the governors would issue quarantines to try and limit the spread of the disease, but Washington and a lot of the other federal officials would leave the city to avoid contamination and did not have any role to play in suppressing it. Nephi Guy Mom asks, I wonder how it would be if it was required that the vice president be from the opposite political party of the president. Well, we've actually had this happen once before. Thomas Jefferson was the second vice president. He was the vice president for President John Adams. They were from the opposite political party, and it was a disaster. Jefferson actually came remarkably close to committing treason when he met with the French minister and encouraged France to continue its attacks on American shipping and encouraged France to avoid any sort of diplomacy with John Adams because he felt that he would win the next election and he would offer them a better deal. JP Moon V1 asks, has any U.S. president ever been fluent in a second language? Yes, they have. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both spoke French. They learned several other languages, especially reading and writing. Perhaps the most fluent was John Quincy Adams, who by the age of 12 spoke almost 5 languages and served as his father's secretary when John Adams went to Europe as a diplomat. John Quincy Adams continued to teach himself new languages throughout the course of his life. Some of the more recent presidents have less facility with language, though there are some who have tried to learn some phrases to be able to meet with foreign leaders, and for example, George W. Bush did speak Spanish. Bossman13156 asks, what was the greatest or most impactful speech in the history of the United States? Well, I think that has to be probably FDR's For Freedom speech, in which he argued that in order for the United States to survive as a democracy and take care of the American people, it had to provide for freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, which basically means freedom from hunger or poverty, and freedom from fear, because fear caused people to pursue things like authoritarian governments. And the speech was really important because it was done in the context of the looming World War II. It was inspiring to people who had to understand why they had to fight for democracy at a time when it didn't always seem like it was working. Gunny Sergeant USMC2 asks, who do you think was the most influential First Lady? I think that's probably Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt served as FDR's eyes and ears because he couldn't necessarily travel due to having to spend most of his time in a wheelchair. So she would travel around the country, she would meet with average Americans and report back to him what she was seeing. She also wrote a newspaper column and was the first First Lady to have press conferences. And she only invited female reporters, which allowed women to actually carve out a space in the journalism profession for the first time. Brightclaw431 asks, did any of the first presidents have any realistic chance of nipping slavery in the bud if they chose to do so? So this is a really interesting question. 12 of the early American presidents owned enslaved individuals, but they didn't necessarily all feel the same way. President George Washington emancipated the individuals that he owned when he died, and some of the other presidents like John Quincy Adams, while he didn't necessarily speak out while he was president, president, afterwards he became a member of Congress, and he regularly spoke out against slavery and the power of slavery in the South. Plains Viewer asks, how many presidents have died while in office? 8 presidents died in office, 4 were assassinated, and 4 died of natural causes. Which is actually pretty surprising because we've only had 45 men serve, which means just under 18% have died while they were president. Kirk asks, what the hell does the vice president do? The vice president has 2 responsibilities. One, they are to cast a tie-breaking vote if the Senate is divided on a piece of legislation. Second is to have a pulse, to be a living replacement to take over the office of the presidency if he dies in office. For the modern vice president, that is still their primary constitutional responsibility. But depending on their relationship with the president, sometimes they are also tasked with other responsibilities. For example, Joe Biden was tasked with overseeing the recovery after the 2008 economic collapse. And more recently, Vice President Kamala Harris was given the responsibility of the relationship with the nations that primarily lead to immigration to the United States from the southern border. Everything else is really up to the president, and most vice presidents have been totally irrelevant in history. Stir-Fried Weiss asks, what did Ulysses S. Grant do to deserve being placed on a $50 bill? Well, Ulysses S. Grant did 2 really important things. First, he was the victorious general in the Civil War when the Union Army defeated the Confederate Army. So winning the Civil War is a pretty big deal. Second, as president, I think he's really underappreciated. He worked really hard to try and bring the Union back together after the Civil War. He worked hard to defend the civil rights and suffrage of recently emancipated African Americans, and he defended their rights and their liberties against violence from the Ku Klux Klan. So I think he generally deserves a lot more credit than he gets. Sign Fine Belly asks, does Donald Trump have unlimited authority to impose tariffs? Well, first of all, a tariff is basically a tax that the United States imposes on an item that is coming in from a foreign nation. Now, most people think that the foreign nation pays the tax and that's the end of it. But what happens is the foreign nation actually increases the prices, and so that item that is coming in is then more expensive for Americans here in the United States. The president does have broad power to put tariffs on items or on things coming in from foreign nations. However, Congress can check that power if it then rejects a tariff through legislation. But this is a really interesting part of the president's responsibilities. While the president does have a lot of power over tariffs, their control over the economy is much more limited than people typically think. For example, Congress is the one that passes the budget. Congress is the one that raises funds. So if you're concerned about the deficit, that is a Congress question. Inflation is even more complicated. Inflation is affected by things like supply chains, conditions around the world, access to goods, how much people want them. And while the president can take steps to try and ameliorate that inflation, they don't have power to reduce it. Additionally, things like interest rates are controlled by the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is supposed to be independent from politics. So while the president can make a request, it's really up to them to change any sort of rate or make any sort of cut. Dan Dino Hill asks, when President Trump takes office in January, he will be the second president to own 2 presidential numbers, 45 and 47. Who was the first president to do so, 22 and 24? No checking or cheating. That would be Grover Cleveland. In 1884, Grover Cleveland won his first election. He was then defeated 4 years later. In 1892, he came back and he defeated Benjamin Harrison and won his second term. A lot of the same concerns that voters had in 1888 and 1892, things like immigration, tariffs, and the economy, are issues that we're seeing today. Good to Be Human asks, what is the deal with George Washington and the cherry tree? George Washington did have cherry trees on his estate at Mount Vernon, and in fact, recently we uncovered a discovery of preserved bottles that had cherries in them. The story with George Washington and the cherry tree is that when he was a young boy, he cut down a cherry tree, and then when his father asked him about it, he said, "I cannot tell a lie," and admitted to doing so. But there is no truth or evidence that suggests that he cut down a cherry tree when he was a child. This is a myth that was made up by a man named Parson Weems, or Mason Locke Weems. And he wrote a book about Washington shortly after Washington's death that was frankly filled with a whole lot of garbage. But it suited him because he was trying to tell a story about Washington's character and the national mythology, and it sold really, really well. Alexa Lauren XO asks, we're talking about the Great Depression, and Anthony Moscato goes, where did all the presidents live before the White House was built? LOL. George Washington lived in several different houses. He lived in 2 different residences in New York City, which is where the seat of the federal government was for about a year when he was first president. The seat of government then moved to Philadelphia, and he rented a house which became known as the President's House. And he lived there until he retired in 1797. John Adams, the second president of the United States, lived there until November 1800. Then he moved to Washington, D.C. with the rest of the federal government and became the first president to live in the White House. Every president since has done so, with the exception of James Madison once the White House burned down in the War of 1812, and he moved just down the street to the Octagon House until it was completed. And Harry Truman also moved across the street into the Blair House when there was a massive renovation of the White House during his term. He What asks, how much blame could we actually give to Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression? It definitely wasn't Herbert Hoover's fault that the economy collapsed. There were a lot of structural weaknesses and impediments in the way of a strong economy. There was a big bubble that had collapsed once it was clear that the speculation was not sustainable. Where Hoover did receive a lot of blame was his lackluster response. He believed that the economy would right itself and capitalism could be trusted to take over, and he didn't do much to try and take care of the American people when they were really suffering. So I think he could definitely be blamed for not doing enough to try and fix the Great Depression. History in Brief asks, so was Edith Wilson the actual president for a year while Woodrow was recovering from a stroke? Hashtag Edith Wilson, first woman president. Well, she certainly didn't have the official title or the official office. But yeah, I think Edith Wilson was primarily acting as president for most of the time that Wilson was incapacitated. She determined who came in to see him, who got to talk to him. She would report back his decisions at a time when we know that he wasn't really able to speak and we're not really sure he understood what was happening. So she had enormous authority that was not elected or was given to her by the Constitution. What's most important about this is that most people didn't really know what was happening. The cabinet had a sense that Wilson was far more ill than people realized, but most people were not permitted to actually see the president, and so most Americans did not know who was actually in charge. My Tai asks, Alexa, what presidents have been impeached? Well, there have been 4 impeachments in U.S. history. The first, Andrew Johnson, was impeached for trying to remove cabinet secretaries, which violated the Tenure of Office Act. Bill Clinton was impeached for lying under oath. And Donald Trump was impeached twice. First, for withholding funds from Ukraine for political purposes, and then for his role in the January 6th insurrection. No president has been removed from office. South Bay Boy 8 asks, there haven't been 2 presidents in a row of the same party since Reagan and H.W. Bush. Why do you think this is? Well, I think the American people get frustrated with a party. They have relatively little patience and frankly sometimes short attention spans, and so they want to elect something new. That hasn't always been the case. Franklin D. Roosevelt, of course, won 4 elections in a row, and then Harry Truman won an election in his own right, and he was from the same party. Chopstick Fury 01 asks, which president would you have the hardest time beating in a drinking contest? That would have to be James Buchanan. James Buchanan was known for being able to put down quite a number of bottles of liquor and not even show it, so he would definitely drink me under the table. Crates of Nutella asks, just how much security do past presidents get, and how extensive is it? Past presidents get Secret Service protection, as do their spouses. And this was required by a law passed in 1965 after Kennedy's assassination, which recognized that both presidents and former presidents often receive threats and need additional protection. The early presidents had no protection. There were no gates outside the president's house, and there was no Secret Service. Secret Service didn't start protecting the president until 1901. So while some presidents like Abraham Lincoln occasionally had a military guard, it wasn't guaranteed by Congress. Former presidents didn't start getting protection until 1965, when Congress passed legislation ensuring that presidents and first ladies receive protection for the rest of their lives. Roman UVA asks, do presidents age faster in office? Absolutely. Have you seen the pictures? Presidents go gray so fast while in office because the demands of the job are so intense. There are no easy decisions or choices that come to their desk. The working hours are often quite intense, and you can really see the impact of stress on their face. A Reddit user asks, how has the office of the President of the United States changed over time? Well, in some ways, the office of the presidency really hasn't changed at all. George Washington established a presidency that was the primary actor when it came to foreign policy and domestic crises. and really carved out enormous powers and jurisdiction for himself and his successors. In other ways, the executive branch has really expanded. We have far more executive departments, their responsibilities are much greater, and the number of employees in them is so far beyond what could have been imagined in the 1790s. So the scope of the federal government is much bigger, even if the idea of the president is the same. Radio Girl Karen asks, yep, Abe Lincoln was the tallest US president, but who was the shortest? No political comments necessary. Testing your presidential smarts. Well, that would probably be James Madison. James Madison was either 5'2" or 5'3", depending on reports, and he was pretty frail as well. What's interesting is his wife, Dolly Madison, was probably 5'8" or 5'9", and she would wear these giant turbans to really accentuate her height. Barry G. Sexy asks, I wonder how many presidents killed another human being? And do we suppose any did so outside of the army? Andrew Jackson probably killed someone in a duel, yeah? You are right. In May of 1806, Andrew Jackson killed Charles Dickinson over a dispute over a horse that Jackson owned. Jackson was also wounded in the chest, but he survived. And this duel was later used against him in presidential elections, arguing that he was blood hungry and he was eager to kill people. Dr. Digipole asks, trivia question, how many US presidents have been arrested? Bonus, name them. During the presidency, just one, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was arrested while president for speeding down Pennsylvania Avenue in his horse and carriage, and he had been warned repeatedly by police that he was going too fast, but he couldn't help himself, and he really loved a fast ride. Tyler Syke asks, who do you guys think was the most stylish president of the 20th century? Well, Barack Obama got a lot of flack for his tan suit, but I personally thought it looked great. Other presidents that were known for being quite debonair include John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan as well. I Fight Possums asks, what presidents had unusual interests or hobbies? FDR was an avid stamp collector, and his stamp collection is still available at his presidential library. Cal Lover asks, how much do presidents get paid? Currently, presidents make $400,000 a year. Originally, the salary was for $25,000, which was a huge amount of money in 1789 when George Washington became president. But that money had to cover rent for the president's house, labor, food, all expenses related to travel, and any time they hosted. So it actually went really quickly, and most presidents in the early republic left office in debt. Humble Translator 466 asks, which president was the best practical joker? This has to be Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson loved to play jokes on people, and in fact, he even had a car that could work in the water as a boat, and so he would drive around guests on his farm in Texas, and he would go too fast down a hill and cause them to think that they were going to run into the water and then the car would sink. And instead, it would float and it would start puttering around like any other boat. He always got a good laugh and he really loved their reactions. Datboy Chicas asks, quick, somebody, why did President Truman decide to use atomic weapons during World War II? This was a decision that President Truman agonized over because he understood the repercussions and the scale of the death and damage that was going to be done to the Japanese people. But he believed that in doing so, he was actually saving American lives. His generals and his advisors had given him estimates for how much it would cost and how many lives would be sacrificed to try and take additional Japanese territory, and he believed that in doing so, he would end the war as quickly as possible. Real Mr. Paramount asks, so what does Commander-in-Chief mean as defined in the Constitution of the United States of America? Anyone? As the Constitution originally defines it, the Commander-in-Chief is the person that is in charge of the armed forces of the United States. So as president, they get to determine the officers, they can appoint people, but Congress is responsible for passing legislation that determines the rules and regulations that manage the Army, Navy, and other armed forces. Remove Different 3357 asks, do you believe Polk's war with Mexico was justified? And should we view the war as a positive or negative of his legacy? Polk's legacy is really interesting because he was generally viewed as actually one of the most effective presidents. He came into office saying he wanted to accomplish a couple of things, including annexing Texas and getting more territory in the Northwest. And he did those things, and then he left after one term. So in terms of promises made, promises kept, he is certainly up there. However, The war with Mexico was very much ginned up to try and seize additional territory. And in doing so, it killed a lot of innocent people, it displaced thousands of native Mexicans, and it led to the expansion of slavery in the American West, which was the major trigger that led to the Civil War. My Vote Doesn't Matter asks, who's your choice for the best president on foreign policy? It's really hard to choose best and worst because there are so many options. But one of the most effective presidents on foreign policy was George H.W. Bush, who oversaw the end of the Cold War in a peaceful way. There were no nuclear explosions, there was no World War III, and he did so exercising restraint and humility. He didn't gloat, and he really could have. But he was only a one-term president. The thing is, the American people very rarely vote on foreign policy, and we tend not to reward people for wars that don't happen or for avoiding conflict. We do reward presidents when they win wars, and since George H.W. Bush didn't do that, his contributions are often not as remembered as they should be. Shahari asks, why did Martha Washington burn George's letters? Well, it's because he asked her to. Just like most people, those letters probably contained all the snarkiness and the humor and the love and the really intimate stuff that we tend to share with our loved ones. That's not how he wanted to be remembered. Instead, he wanted to be remembered as a little bit more aloof, a little bit more reserved, the image he had crafted, kind of like a marble bust, just like this one. Okay, that's it. That's all the questions. I hope you learned something. Until next time.